Does anybody know the rock band The Police or the singer Sting? Does that date me a little bit too much? When the Police first started touring in the United States, they would go to these bars and clubs, and there would be 2 people, 1 person, 3 people in the bar. And Sting, the leader of the group, said, "I don't care how many people are there, we're giving the best performance of our life." And I agree with that wholeheartedly. The posters, and Sid asked me for a title for the talk, and I threw out the title "Achieving Excellence in the World of Architecture," and then as I thought about it, I thought to myself, damn, I wish somebody could tell me how to do that. No matter what you do, no matter how far you get in achieving what you want to achieve, there's always one thing that always lingers. What more can I do? How can I refine it one more step? So I changed the title to Achieving Excellence. If anybody could tell me how. I've broken the talk down into 3 basic categories. What inspired me to do this in the first place, the education or some of my work while I was in school, but the education necessary to be a registered architect, and then the third category or the third chapter of the talk is some of my work. I'm going to focus, as Sid said, on a single-family residence as a case study, a university building, one up at Cornell University, and then I added a third building, and I hope me fidgeting with the topic is okay. But I added a third building which was proposed over here back in 2010 next to the Tech Ed building, and unfortunately was not realized, and I can describe to you some of the sorrows that go along with that. There were many things when I first started considering what I was going to do when I went into college. My father was an engineer, my brother was an engineer, my grandfather was an engineer. I have this aptitude for math that frightens some people, primarily myself. But I always had this love of drawing and sketching. And as I talked to different people, they said, well, why don't you become an architect? What I found subsequently is that the use of math in architecture is next to nothing. It's really more about trying to realize spaces, trying to realize details, trying to find ways to make textures. And then as I learned through the process and through studying architecture, this is a building in western Pennsylvania, about an hour and a half southeast of Pittsburgh, called Fallingwater. It was designed and built in 1936 to 38 by the American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. And one of the things that's always fascinated me about this building is that it's not just a building. It's the expression of a way of life. And in this particular case, the way of life is integration with and harmony with nature. And this is the natural setting, right? I don't think human activity is any less natural than an otter taking a rock and cracking a nut open on its belly. I think we're just a lot more sophisticated than the otter. In this particular case, some of the ideas were to use the stone quarried locally, right? These are principles. You're going to hear principles that sound like sustainability today, right? People talk about green building, green architecture, LEED, sustainability. These principles have always been around. People who were, in my opinion, the best practitioners throughout history have adhered to those principles and found ways to make things that talk about the setting, the people for whom they designed the buildings. In this particular case, the Kaufman family loved the waterfall. They used to bask on the rocks under the falling water. Under the falling water. They kept talking about that. We love standing under the falling water. That's when Frank Lloyd Wright said, falling water. That's the name of the house. But the stone is quarried locally. The materials to form the concrete are quarried locally. The color chosen for the balconies is the color of a rhododendron leaf after it's fallen and decayed. All of these things hint at and pick up bits and pieces of the surroundings. and begin to become the story of not only that place, but the people who inhabit the building. I saw that first when I was about 12, 13 years old, and I had just gotten right at the end of 6th grade. And I thought to myself, boy, if an architect can do that, I want to be an architect. This is the interior of the dome of the Pantheon in Rome, 2,000-year-old concrete structure, right? And what fascinates me about this, number one, 2,000-year-old concrete structure, we can't even make bridges that last 100 years. But what they did is you could see these recesses into the ceiling. They're not just decoration. They made recesses into the concrete to lighten the weight of the whole structure, so that the structure would become sound, so that the structure would stand and not collapse through time. So the decorative element in the ceiling is actually structurally necessary. And I thought to myself, boy, that's kind of great. It's like a house of cards almost, where everything has to be necessary or else it doesn't work. There's nothing superfluous, nothing over and above that doesn't absolutely need to be there. I was fortunate enough to do a little bit of traveling. Sid mentioned that I won a fellowship with a project I designed, and I was able to go to Italy, a lot of Europe, some parts of the Middle East. This is a church in Venice, and these are some sketches that I do as I travel. One of my ambitions is to travel without a camera and force myself to draw everything. And it's funny because I've got mountains of, if people remember what slides were, I've got mountains of digital photographs, and sometimes I'm going through these images and I think to myself, you know, I don't even remember being there, much less taking the photograph. But when I sketch something, you have to sit, you have to study it visually, you're looking at it and you're translating and looking at it and translating. My memory for the things that I draw, and this is true of everybody I've ever dealt with, when they draw something, no matter how poorly or successfully, they remember it much more effectively. So this love that I had of just drawing on my walls in my bedroom, which disturbed my mother, but I think she got it. This love that I have of drawing and this aptitude for math kind of all conspired to push me in the direction of studying architecture. This is Machu Picchu in Peru. What fascinated me when I saw the first photographs of this when I was younger, kind of mid to late teens, was how somebody could actually take the top of a mountain and carve that mountaintop in order to live. And you can see the terracing, which was done for agriculture. The plazas, while it may look like a nice green lawn, are actually very complex structures composed of a series of layers to catch, channel, and filter the water so that they could capture the water in cisterns. So going back to the previous photograph, what looks like something that's very simple is actually very complex, and it's designed to make life in this place possible. They don't have pipes, they don't just throw the switch on and water comes out. They had to figure out ways to deal with this. They then took those methods of capturing water and made them into beautiful fountains. This is a wall at a site in Peru called Sacsayhuaman. You can see, I always get a kick, people say, look at how big the stones are. People couldn't possibly have done that, it must be aliens. I always get a kick out of that because I think if anybody's inspired by something that really moves them, they can achieve amazing things. I don't care who you are. There are instances where, and this is a complete offshoot or a complete tangent, but there are instances where a mother is watching her child play near the car that's up on the jacks that the father's working on, and the car collapses on the child, or the jack collapses and the car falls on, and the mother lifts the car to pull the child out. People are capable of amazing things. This is one of those amazing things to me. How does a person or a series of people move a stone that's the size of a car and put it into place, and more importantly, carve it in such a way that you have these beautiful interlocking pieces. And you can see a whoops right there, huh? It's not perfect, which proves to me it's not alien. This is another one of those things that I saw when I was younger that it just fascinated me beyond belief. It's called the sun dagger. You can see that it's a spiral glyph carved into the stone. And what this is light. There are a series of stones stacked up in front of that wall where the glyph is carved. And the stones are cut in such a way, they're shaped in such a way that you can see it here. These three images are my sketches studying what's happening here. At the highest point, when the sun is at the highest point in the sky, the summer solstice, the light comes through the openings between the rocks and pierces the center of the glyph. At the equinox, right, September and March, when the sun is at its midpoint in the height of the sky, at noon, you have a bracket. At the lowest point, you have two brackets of light grabbing the glyph, right? So that as the sun, in the winter, the sun's lower in the sky, that's why the days are shorter, right? So the sun is low in the sky, the light comes through two openings and forms brackets on the glyph. In the summertime, as the sun rises in the sky and the days become longer, at that high point, a dagger of light pierces the center of the glyph. And I thought to myself, holy cow, this is a stone, or a series of stones that are telling me something about the movement of the universe. And that just, for me, that was just, holy cow, that's so cool. People talk about how, primitive cultures, in a lot of ways, I think some ways we're regressing, in other ways we're advancing. And I think as technology advances us, we lose some of these fundamentals and these basic things. How could they have created a structure that, stacking 2 million stones? I mean, that's pretty much all they did. They didn't have, Sex and the City on TV to watch. This is another structure that inspired me very early on called Stonehenge. Many of you might be familiar. Stonehenge is a series of circles, right? Very large stones. And all of these lines are diagrams showing the sunrise of the summer sun. There's a heel stone here, so there's an alignment that forms to the center of the structure when the sun rises on the day of the solstice. And a lot of these things, a lot of these measuring tools or marking tools were designed for agriculture so that they would know when to plant, when to harvest, right? So this was their clock. They didn't have a little Swiss watch and with a date on it. Oh, hey, Jimmy, it's the 21st. We better go out and pull some weeds. They didn't have that, so they had to mark using what they had around them. But a very, very complex structure, right? You have the sunset in the winter. You have the moon rise, the rising and setting of the moon. In a lot of cultures, the moon was seen as a more powerful god than the sun because it didn't rise and set predictably, or at least as predictably as the sun, right? It varied its position in the sky, varied its shape, and for those reasons, it was viewed as more powerful. All of those things, coming back to the world of architecture, all of those things were incorporated into structures, and the structures became the stories of what the cultures believed about the universe. It influenced the way they lived on the planet. And this is a photograph of Stonehenge at sunset on the summer solstice. Fortunately, there's not tens of thousands of people like there are now, but this beautiful alignment and correspondence between something we've built and the workings of the universe that make our lives possible. This is a photograph of a church that I did when I was in school. I designed when I was in school, and I'll talk a little bit about it and how it influenced, how those inspirations influenced the way that I came to start designing a building. Maybe coffee wasn't the best choice. These are sketches, a floor plan sketch, a building section sketch, perspective sketch of a project I designed in school. I'm just going to touch on these very briefly and then spend a little bit more time as I get into the professional work. But the thought was that there's a spring back here. The spring is channeled through the building, and then these three dots or openings in the wall would channel the sunlight down onto a pool in a courtyard. And the reason for three was because this was designed for my parents. They had 3 children, and the slots, the openings through the wall were angled in such a way that the light would come through on our respective birthdays. So the building, oh, it is cool. This is cool stuff. I love this stuff. But this was a way of saying, this is a story. This is a story of 2 people who came together, who raised 3 children, and who always kept those 3 children as the highest priority in their life. So much so that they built their house around it. Right? It's concrete, it's wood, but it's talking about love. It's talking about what makes us human. Continuing the journey of traveling, experiencing things, going to museums. These are sketches from the National Museum in Athens of pottery, bits and pieces. And you can see some of the structures. They call this the folded arm person. Nobody really knows why he's folded armed. They suspect that maybe it was somebody who was losing their mind and they bound them, but nobody really knows for sure. I love those mysteries because it just keeps raising more and more questions. This is, we're not really sure if it's a snake or a bird snake, but it was an adornment to a pot, to a ceramic pot. And these little bits and pieces, again, this is their mythology, the culture who made it. They made this to talk about something important to them. They didn't make it frivolously. They didn't make it because it was cheap. They didn't make it because it would sell a lot. They made it because it was important to them, and it was a method of communication to the younger generation. Through school, sketching is everywhere. And you're trying to find desperately, you're young, you're trying to figure out who you are, what you want to say, and you're desperately trying to find a way that what you're putting on paper and what you're sketching can become a language, can become a story about something, and then you elaborate on that story as time unfolds. And just sketches upon sketches upon sketches, and all of them begin to suggest things. And then, as it becomes more real, you start thinking about details, right? This is a shelf, and this is the connection piece to the shelf, and it's recessed down into the wood, so it's concealed from sight. You begin to think about how the materials that we have available to us as our palette come together. This is a photograph, an aerial photograph of Istanbul, Turkey. And in the foreground here is the Blue Mosque of Istanbul, and off in the distance here is the Hagia Sophia. The Hagia Sophia was designed in the 500s by it was under the reign of Constantine. It was designed as a Christian church. It has since been converted to a mosque, but originally it was designed as a Christian church. The organization of the space is linear, axial, right? Because in Christian ritual, Christian ceremonies, right, you have the procession up the aisle to the altar, to the pulpit. So the architecture of the Hagia Sophia talks about Christianity. The Blue Mosque is square in plan. There's a prayer wall, right? These are the icons of Islam. These are the things that are necessary to the ritual of praying so many times a day. And you can see there's a subtle difference in the orientation, right? The prayer wall is, when you're facing the prayer wall, you're looking towards Mecca. So they didn't align them as we would in a city. They built them based on the ritual. So again, the positioning of the building, the siting of the building talks about the rituals that the building was built for. The piece of property, and this was an international competition, but the piece of property we had to work with was between the two structures. The program for the building was an anthropology museum. So you have a Christian church, an Islamic mosque. So now we're supposed to integrate a building that talks about human beings between them. Thinking about it, sketching, getting frustrated, throwing stuff at the wall, getting into fights with people because I'm grumpy. A little while later, I start coming up with the thought that, you know, if we're going to live on the planet together, the only thing we have in common is that we're people. I have one ideology, someone else has another ideology. If we're going to fight because of the ideologies, we're never going to get along. We're never going to see eye to eye. But if I understand that that person over there, while they believe something different, still has the same blood flowing through their veins that I do, still has fingers, right, muscles. That commonality is the method that we have to employ to really start working together and living together peacefully. This was a very crude study model, but this was supposed to be the Hagia Sophia. This is supposed to be the Blue Mosque. And what eventually I came up with was taking the anthropology museum and burying it like we would bury a dead body. But the roof would become all glass. At night, when the museum is lit, you'd get this glow of light coming up from below. During the day, when you're in the museum, you'd see the shadows of people walking across the path. Some along the path, some across the path, but shadows would begin to dance in and around during the day. Light would glow out through the night. And I began to think that, you know, that understanding of letting our humanity take precedence over our ideology is really a path of the illuminated person, right? The person who's really achieved a level of understanding about how to live here on the earth. So I started referring to it as the path of light. Metaphorically, it's the path of connection between the two ideologies through our humanity. Physically, it's actually a path that's illuminated. It's a lighted path. It's important that architecture means something because it's what's left when we're gone. Right? People travel millions and millions of miles every year, not one person, theoretically, but to see architecture. I was looking at a list, somebody created a list of the 30 places you have to see before you die. 24 of them were architecture. The other 6 were like the Grand Canyon, right? Angel Falls, but buildings, the remnants of people that have come before us. And through understanding those remnants of people, you begin to start understanding your position here on Earth, your place here on Earth. And you can be a little bit more empathetic to somebody who may have done something goofy. You know, a lot of people come down on them. No, we're all here together. We all make mistakes, right? This, in my opinion, is the right course. I'm a person, you're a person. Let's start there. Everything else we'll put aside for the time being. That's the method that we can use to live harmoniously. Inside, you're seeing the shadows, right? This is a perspective looking inside. This is a cross section, and you can see the scale. Here are people up on top of the path, right? Little tiny. And as you go further into the ground, right, it gets darker and darker in the museum. The museum was composed of 2 paths that were intertwined one to the other. So you wind down and then you wind back up. And the metaphor again was the DNA, the structure of a DNA molecule. This is a church. This is a different project. I called it the Church of St. Barbara. Through my research, I learned that St. Barbara was the patron saint of the architect, so I thought, I need all the help I can possibly get. So I named the church for her, but this was proposed down in Virginia, north up, south down, east, west. The structure or the organization, Baptistry Bell Tower at the east, the symbol for birth, the church, or the body of the congregation in the center. And then on the western end, an open-air chapel for funerals. And the chapel was structured as a square floor, and then around the square floor were the Stations of the Cross in the form of a circle. And the square inscribed in the circle is the Christian symbol for the threshold between earth and heaven. So the organization, birth, rising sun, bell tower, rising sun, calling of the service, the body, and then the end of life, or the spirit. Parking was organized to the north, colder, darker. The parking was, and I don't know if you can really make it out, but subdivided into small square rooms. Each room held 12 cars, the symbol of the apostles, right? And then as people came closer and closer, there was a big open plaza. So all the people would filter through, come down, gather in a plaza, and then go into the church, go into the bell tower. To the south was a cemetery. Again, you die, your spirit goes up towards the light, so push that, move that to the south. This is a computer rendering of the front entrance. This was a while ago, so computer renderings are still a little on the crudish side. But what you can see here, the handicap ramp is integrated into the stairs. And the attempt, the hope was that in weaving these two things together, I could talk about the humanity of everybody, regardless of capability. The structure, there were these heavy walls, and then these very delicate, I call them trees, very delicate structure forming the roof. Again, through the research, I found that the Greeks, people are familiar with like the Parthenon, Greek temples with all the columns and stuff that people copy these days and give me the willies. But those temples, before they actually started carving them out of marble, they would send a holy man, and it was a man, so it's not a sexist thing, I don't think, but they would send a holy man out into the woods. When that holy man had a religious experience, he would define that space as the temple. What they would do is then put a fence or a wall around that grove of trees. And this is kind of a very abstract version where you have a grove of trees and then the heavy walls surrounding the trees. So even though it's a Christian church, it's organized as a Christian church, the origin and the roots or the seeds of it go all the way back through time to the very earliest days prior to people actually building buildings to serve as temples. Another computer rendering of the interior here. You're up high looking down into the sanctuary. And you'll notice that it's very formally arranged. It's called a basilica. St. Peter's is a basilica, the cathedrals are basilicas. But the altar is pushed to one side, and the pulpit is pushed to the other side of the central axis. And what this little cross in the circle here is, this was very interesting. The equal arm cross is considered to be Greek Orthodox. But very early on in Rome, the earliest Roman Catholics used to wear a pendant, circular pendant, with a cross inscribed to recognize one another to avoid persecution. So I thought that the cross inscribed in the circle is more Roman Catholic, and this was a Roman Catholic church, was more Roman Catholic than the Latin cross, which evolved much later.
What year was this?
This building?
Built?
It wasn't built. This was a school project.
Oh, all right.
But if you know somebody that has a couple of $100 million, that would be good.
That's what I'm wondering. Like, approximately, when were you working on this? What year?
1990, about 20 years ago, 1992, 93.
Okay, thank you.
But the point of shifting the altar off the axis was to make the point of communion, the place where people would receive the communion, the most important place in the building, not the hierarchy of the church. You can imagine how well that flew with a lot of my very religious instructors. This is a model, a wooden model that was constructed, and yes, if you're curious, these are toothpicks. And I used to have hair, but not anymore. But this is a model of the front, and you can see that stair with the ramp woven into the stair. The important thing, and the reason I wanted to show this, was because the proportions, and I have this conversation with clients all the time about the proportions of their buildings. The proportions of a human being, right? The belly button is half the height of my body. My eyes are halfway up my head, right? And the better proportioned people tend to be more attractive, right, to the human eye. There have been a lot of studies that show this. But the proportions of the building make it read well or make it read kind of uncomfortable. In this case, the proportion is the base of the column, or the shaft of the column, is a square, and above the square is an equilateral triangle. The images are distorted. This one's wide and that one's narrow, but the proportions were the square and an equilateral triangle. And again, in Christian symbolism, the square is the symbol for the earthly dwelling. The equilateral triangle is the symbol for the Holy Trinity. So the square for the earthly dwelling comes up to the top of the walls, and then above the walls is all glass and structure, or light. Since the building was arranged on a direct east-west axis and not magnetic, geographic, at sunset on the equinox, there would be this alignment of the cross on the rear wall behind the choir and the cross on the entrance wall, and they would be connected by sunlight. So the shadow of one would exactly cast on the shadow, or the form of the other. So that was me in school. Cool stuff. If I could get it built, I would love it. Like I said, if you know somebody with a couple $100 million wants to build a cathedral, I'm in.
Did you build your parents' house?
No, the work that you've just seen, none of it was built, but those ideas and thoughts have influenced what has happened since. It's like a file. You fill the file with a lot of ideas. A lot of them aren't realized, but then, ooh, you know, hey, I did this 20 years, and I'll show you exactly that when I get to the building here on the campus, or the proposed building here on the campus. After all of those investigations and thoughts about, oh my gosh, you know, how do we create meaning in architecture, then I started working, and I started getting into the world of building codes, right? Regulations, rules. In my opinion, they're for the betterment of safety. So we can sit here and not worry about being blown up or catch on fire readily. Zoning codes talk about what's allowed on the site. Building codes talk about the building and what you have to do to make the building safe. Then you have existing building codes. Then you have accessibility codes. You have mechanical codes for HVAC. Then you have energy conservation codes to make sure we're not burning through our oil too quickly. Then you have plumbing codes, there's electrical codes, and the list just keeps going. All of this is kind of like the playbook or the game book. And then you're given a site, a piece of property, by somebody with white pants. And you begin to sketch. And you do your research, right? You make sure you're code compliant. So you start sketching floor plans. You start sketching building structure. You start sketching handrails. And at the top of the handrail is a place for my coffee mug because I'm sick and tired of leaving the door, turning around to lock the door and spilling the coffee on me. I need a place to set my coffee mug when I turn around to lock the door and go on my merry way. Again, it talks about life. Just a little tiny story about life. Start thinking about the building structure, and you can see the plumbing here, right? And it starts to get cohesive, it starts to become real. The sketches start to become more vivid, right? You start to work with ideas like the siding material, right? If I step the siding material and it casts a shadow, which is like a stair, and that alludes to the stair inside. It's like a ghost on the outside of the building, talking about what's happening inside the building. Then you start thinking even more in more detail about how air flows through the space. We have operable windows up high and operable windows down low. It'll prompt airflow through the space. And then you submit this to the building planning department. And they say, sorry, you exceed the height limit. And I said, well, the definitions are a flat roof, the height limit for a flat roof, and the definition for a sloped roof. This is very definitely a sloping roof. It's not a flat roof. I think that that's fairly objective. The definition is to take the midpoint of the slope, right? The high point, the low point, take the midpoint. And if the grade is sloping, you take the average height, right? High point, low point. This is the average of those two. And you're limited to 34, in this case, 34 feet 6 inches. So that's the height of the building as defined by the zoning code. 34 feet 6 inches allowable. If we do 34 or 33 feet, foot and a half below, we'll coast right through. Rejected. Called the zoning official. He says, no, the height is too high in the front. We didn't anticipate somebody sloping a roof like this. It's a shed roof. Single slope, one direction, the oldest form of roof known to the human being. He says, yeah, but the land falls and the roof rises. We didn't anticipate that. I said, well, but you can't create new codes to restrict something that somebody submits because you didn't think hard enough to anticipate it. That's illegal. He says, get a lawyer. Can we meet? Can we talk about this? I drove down. This is Montgomery County, Maryland. So it's down near Washington, D.C. He concedes to the meeting. The owner lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland, so he's right there. We meet. We get in. We talk to the building official. He says, no. He says, this is not a sloped roof. This is a flat roof because it looks flat from the front. I'm gonna zoom quick through. Right? It looks flat from the front. So he's defining it as a flat roof instead of a slope roof. But really what they're looking for is that somebody would slope the roof. You take the midpoint of the height of the roof here, the average grade, right? But the front of the building is actually lower because of the way the roof is sloping. He says, that's what we want. And I said, well, but you can't arbitrarily pick and choose based on what somebody, he said, I don't care what argument you make, go through the appeals process. So here we are, ready to go. Financing is already arranged. The owner's got the financing in place. And he says, if you file an appeal, you're gonna have to wait 3 to 4 months to get into the appeal review. Then there's a 6 to 8 month waiting period to get a decision, conceivably. So a year from now, you might be under construction. I could say a lot of things right now, but I know I should be polite and respectful, so.
I have a question.
Yes.
Could you have taken your design and just thrown it? How many feet is that? Because you was just something.
The problem is right about here. This is the library space. If this dropped down, right, that would start to pinch. It has a domino effect through everything.
The whole thing. Could you make basement, put the oven to the earth?
We were using the basement for 2 bedrooms, so we wanted it to be a walkout condition. If you recess it down into the ground, it becomes damper. It becomes less conditionable as a space.
And how many feet was it that they were talking about there at the top?
This was the 33 feet. This was about 42 feet at the highest point here. Right? So we were, according to him, we were about 7.5 feet too high. So that's their preference. Don't try anything new, just do what everybody else does and you're fine. There was no incentive to try other things. And you can see here, he was saying the front looks flat, the front of the roof looks flat. And I said, but there's no provision that says a slope roof, a flat roof, or if the front of the building looks flat, you use the flat roof. There was no provision in the code. He was making it up. We got it built. I went down to the zoning office and I said, well, what are the other options here? What methods are there to get approval for a building? They said, well, you can go through the traditional zoning process or you could submit a site plan approval. I said, do tell, what is that? He said, you package up all of the special considerations into one set of drawings, you submit that through. It's $1,000. I looked at the owner, and am I allowed to use bad language? I don't think I am. I'll tell her. He says, I'm not letting that effing bureaucrat, he didn't use the word effing, but not letting that effing bureaucrat stop my house. So he wrote a check for $1,000. We submitted the site plan approval. We got a phone call as we were leaving the building saying that we're approved.
Wow.
I consider that extortion. I'm not allowed to say that in public, so I retract my statement. The problem is that the incentive wasn't there, and we found out a couple of weeks later that the zoning official who wouldn't approve this was retiring the following month and didn't want to be bothered with any hassles or questions from anyone. Anyway, the building is there. One of the first things that Carl and Patricia, or the husband and wife, one of the first things they said to me was, we want to wake up with the birds in the morning. So before the building was there, I went out to the site and I was watching the birds flying back and forth between the different branches of the different trees. And I thought to myself, you know, those are their perches. Maybe we need a human perch. And that's what the cantilever balcony over top the stairs here is. It's the human perch. And through the process, you can see the structure is all exposed here. The beam is exposed. The structure is all exposed. And the thought process was that as a bird's perch is the extension of a structure of the tree, this is a human perch, which is an extension, excuse me, of the structure of the house. And that metaphor became the poetry that connected the building to its site. This is an addition to the Hotel School of Administration up at Cornell University. Again, how do you make something that's meaningful in the process of designing using aluminum and steel and concrete? And this is a very, very prominent walkway on the campus. And the atrium space became a display, or a big display case was the metaphor that was used. And you can see the stairs here are right along the glass. There's a balcony, there's a gathering space. You'll see a photograph of that in just a minute. Underneath the skylight here, right? The method or the courtyard to get in, let's see, right? You go this way and the road is going up, but the walkway to get in is flat, right? So we needed a retaining wall, but instead of building a retaining wall, what we started doing is building places for people to gather. So there are benches. The concrete retaining wall is actually sloped back like the seat of a chair, right? And this becomes a little courtyard adjacent to the building. As you get closer to the entry point, you can see the integration of lights here. The reflection into the glass carries your eye visually into the space from the outside of the space. Canopy, which during this process I learned a very interesting and cool phrase called attractive nuisance. And the definition of attractive nuisance is if a drunk college student would do something stupid, it's an attractive nuisance. So we had a lot of discussions about drunk students climbing up on top of the canopy. Everything was structured to support the load of a very heavy person or people, so that we could avoid any litigation or problems that may arise from that attractive nuisance. This is that seating area under the skylight. Views, again, connections to the inside, connections to the outside, bringing natural light into the corridor spaces. And then just providing beautiful spaces. We played with the structure of the stair here. You can see the sloping columns. And the way that I described it was that you could picture a guy, a really kind of pathetic guy, leaning on one of those columns, hitting on a girl, and she's like, oh, God, why won't you just go away? And this is a photograph at night, limestone here. These windows are positioned at landings of the exiting stair. So you get natural light in the exit stairs, which we don't seem to be able to achieve here in the building. But the positioning of the windows is purposeful because it's not the landings. They're not arbitrarily placed. Okay, the last project, and I think I'm a few minutes behind, but this is a concrete pad over by the tech building over on the other side of campus. Right now there's a big kind of wooden structure, and the carpentry students use it to experiment and explore or learn different ways to put wood framing for a building together. This is 2010, right? 2010. The then interim dean, Eric Wellington, said, see what you can come up with for this site. So through a lot of sketching and considerations, you can see this little tiny diagram right there. And I'll show you that in just a second. What we realized is that the building could become a teaching space, and that teaching space could be used to bring people in and show them tangibly the different aspects of building a wooden building. There's something called platform frame, which is when you see a development house going up, wood studs, floor joists, wood studs, roof. You build a platform, then you build another wall and a platform. That's called platform framing. Then another method is called balloon framing, where you use very tall studs to create tall spaces. And then, does everybody know what timber framing is? Where you use really massive pieces of wood to create these beautiful exposed, like a barn. The framing inside of a barn is a timber frame. So, in looking at the problem and trying to figure out ways to maximize the educational potential for the students building it and the use of it as a teaching space, we were proposing different methods of construction for different walls of the building. This is a sketch from 1996 where I was looking at the North Star, right? This is the Earth rotating, here's the rotation, and the building on the face of the planet at our latitude aligns with the North Star. So that as we go around during the course of the day, we're always looking at the North Star, right? There's Polaris, that's the Big Dipper, the two stars of the Big Dipper cradle, a ladle, point right to Polaris. So taking this thought from 1996 and reworking it and using, you can see the heavy timbers along here, balloon framing along here, the seats would pivot. So you could face this direction to learn about timber framing, then you could spin around, learn about balloon framing here, these little rooms, the bathroom and the entry. You could spin around and learn about platform framing there. There was a big, thick concrete wall proposed for the south side. It's called a trom wall. When the sun hits it, it absorbs heat, and then at night, it emits the heat back into the space. But that would be the teaching wall where you'd have the projection screen. So all four directions, cardinal directions, were teaching walls, and each of those directions, you'd learn a different lesson. The section, you can see a person here, sort of, sketched into the space, so it was a fairly tall space. And the angle of the roof aligned, and there's the North Star right there, right? The alignment was to the North Star. The air would flow in low, the glass up high would be vented, so you'd get this natural airflow in through the space. We were talking about using geothermal systems and different kinds of electrical systems to save money and energy, and it would really become this green thing. A whole series, there were probably 15 or 20 of these little models that we did, little study models, and then we were proposing photovoltaic panels or solar panels for the roof to generate the energy, so it could be a building that was completely off the grid. This is the south side, so it's glass to allow the sunlight to hit that concrete wall on the inside of the space, heat it up during the day, made the heat back out into the space. I believe the phrase was, I don't need no effing architect to tell me what to build. I'm not going to say who said that. And I said, what do you want? What, you know, we're trying to build something beautiful. We're trying to build something that can be used for educational purposes. If that's not a desirable thing, I can live with it. I don't like it. But if you go over there, you'll see what was built in its stead. Theoretically, that will be demolished, and then something new will be built. Then after a few years, that'll be demolished. So I still have hopes, still have dreams.
Why did they demolish it after only a year or so?
Because the point of it is to use it. There were two divergent paths that were suggested. One of them was, let's let the carpentry students use it for learning, then we demolish it, then the next generation, the next class of carpentry students use it, then it gets demolished, then the next generation of carpentry students get to use it. And it was literally a teaching thing. The other suggested path was, let's build something that can be used for educational purposes so it becomes a teaching space. And it's there permanently. The carpentry school was going down the first path. The dean asked us, or the interim dean asked us to explore the other path.
So the students were building a building?
They're still using it, yeah, to learn how to put a window in a wall, stuff like that, you know, to learn how to drive a nail into a 2x4. So it's a teaching thing. It's used for educational purposes, but it's always under construction, which for a college campus, you decide for yourself, is that appropriate, is it inappropriate? But it's always fenced off, it's always rough, it's always, you know, the building papers flapping in the breeze. That's it.
Let's thank Ed. If you didn't have a chance to sign the roster, please do so before you leave so we have a record of who attended. And the fourth Tuesday of April will be a talk on mathematics and ecology by my daughter who teaches at Westchester University. There'll be announcements about that in a couple of weeks. Thank you. And here's the roster if you didn't get a chance to sign it. It's up here.